At sunrise, the Colosseum was already breathing like a beast. Its stone arches caught the morning glow, but beneath them, the shadows were restless. The tunnels stirred with the scent of sweat, blood, and damp straw. Slaves whispered as they dragged corpses from the previous night, dumping them into pits no spectator would ever see. The sand above was fresh, raked to hide the crimson stains as if cruelty could be erased with a shovel. Yet everyone knew, by midday, it would be red again. Vendors wheeled in baskets of figs, wine diluted with water, and skewers of roasted meat, their voices rising above the groans of chained prisoners waiting for death. Trumpets blared, sharp and metallic, announcing the opening acts. Not the gladiators, not yet, but the condemned. Criminals, deserters, slaves. Their deaths were not mistakes of justice, they were rehearsals. Rome called it punishment. In truth, it was a warm-up show for the masses. The crowd streamed in, families with children, senators in white togas, merchants smelling of spice. All came for the same thing, cruelty disguised as spectacle. The empire had perfected it, and it was no accident. From the very start, Rome engineered its games as more than entertainment. They were lessons, warnings, propaganda carved into flesh. Every scream from the arena reminded the living who held power. In part 1, we saw gladiators turned into propaganda, beasts slaughtered as trophies of empire, and emperors who drowned their paranoia in blood. But what we didn't see was the machinery behind it all, the hidden rituals, the silent workers, the private horrors whispered about, but rarely written down. Rome's cruelty wasn't only on the surface, it ran deeper, in the sand, in the shadows, in the very bones of the empire. Today, we return to the arena, not for the stories already told, but for the secrets left behind. We'll uncover how mornings began with executions disguised as theatre, how children were trained to cheer at slaughter, how trapdoors and stage machinery turned death into illusion, and how slaves and prisoners paid the price for every moment of applause. This is part 2 of ancient Rome's most brutal and inhumane arena acts that went too far. So take your seat. The gates are opening again, and what waits behind them is darker than you imagine. The Romans never wasted a spectacle. Every arena day was carefully choreographed, a cruel theatre divided into acts, and the opening act began early, when the morning sun stretched across the marble seats and the crowd was still filing in with baskets of bread and cups of watered wine. The Romans called it the meridiani, the midday shows, but in truth, the killing started even earlier. Before the gladiators entered, before the beasts were unleashed, there was a ritual that set the tone for the entire day: executions. They were not the main event, they were the warm-up. Criminals, deserters, runaway slaves, and prisoners of war were hauled into the sand at dawn. Some were executed swiftly, beheaded before the eyes of a half-awake audience. Others were dragged in for more elaborate punishments, crucifixions raised like grotesque decorations around the arena, or men set on fire in pitch-soaked shirts that turned them into human torches. These deaths were not about suspense or skill. They were about reminding the crowd from the very first moment that the arena belonged to Rome, and Rome decided who lived and who died. Music signaled the start. Trumpets blared, sharp and metallic, echoing off the stone like the horns of war. Drummers kept rhythm as prisoners were marched across the sand, their chains clinking in time. Vendors hawked food above the noise, their calls mixing with the sound of flesh being struck, of screams rising and then cut short. Children sat beside their parents, watching as men begged for mercy that would never come. To Roman eyes, this was not corruption, it was education. To see justice delivered in the sand was to learn Rome's order of things. Disobedience met death, loyalty bought survival. These executions were sometimes staged like miniature plays, curtain raisers before the greater dramas of the day. A thief might be torn apart by wild dogs, an arsonist burned alive, a deserter forced to fight blindfolded until he collapsed. Each punishment fit its crime in a grim parody of fairness. The audience didn't question it. They applauded. For them, this was the sharpening of appetite, cruelty served in small portions before the feast of violence still to come. The scheduling was deliberate. By saving animal hunts for midday and gladiators for evening, Rome built suspense, keeping the crowd restless, eager, hungry for more. Executions at dawn were not entertainment in themselves. They were the opening note of a symphony of death. Without them, the rest of the day would not have the same sting, the same escalation from horror to spectacle. By the time the sun reached its peak, the arena floor was already littered with bodies, dragged away in haste, the sand raked fresh again. And the crowd, far from sickened, was only more excited. They had tasted blood with their breakfast. Now they were ready for the real show. The Colosseum was never just an arena. It was a classroom, and the pupils were not only the hardened men and women who filled the seats, but the children sitting on their parents' laps, their small eyes watching as men screamed, animals lunged, and blood sprayed across the sand. To a Roman child, cruelty was not hidden behind walls. It was presented as spectacle, wrapped in ritual and framed as civic duty. Writers of the time hint at the presence of children in the stands. Families attended the games together, not unlike modern families gathering for festivals or holidays. But in Rome, the holiday began with corpses. Fathers explained the punishments as moral lessons. This thief burned because he broke the law, this slave crucified because he disobeyed his master, this gladiator dead because he lacked skill or courage. Death in the arena was a storybook written in flesh, and children were expected to read it. For Rome, this was education. The games were not designed to shock the young. They were designed to train them. To cheer at executions was to absorb the rhythm of Roman justice. To clap at the fall of a gladiator was to learn that power, not pity, ruled the empire. The arena did not corrupt innocence, it erased it. Archaeology has given us glimpses of how deeply this training extended. In Pompeii, charred by Vesuvius but frozen in time, toys have been found that mimic the weapons of the gladiators. Miniature helmets, small wooden swords, even models of shields. Roman boys were given these not as novelties, but as tools to practice the gestures they saw in the arena. To play was to prepare, to reenact the violence that one day they might perform in the legions or, if unlucky, in the sand itself. Elite families went further. Some commissioned ludi puerorum, games of children, where young boys staged mock battles in small arenas, often with wooden weapons but occasionally with real injuries. These were not the innocent games of childhood. They were rehearsals for war, rehearsals for empire. Roman culture believed courage was cultivated not through kindness, but through exposure to brutality. A boy who flinched at a man being mauled by lions would one day flinch on the battlefield. A boy who cheered, who laughed, who demanded more, that was a citizen worthy of Rome. Mothers, too, played their part. Ancient sources describe women pushing their sons to watch, to stay seated, to hold back tears. Compassion was weakness, unbecoming of a Roman male. Stoicism was the lesson, and the arena was the chalkboard on which it was written. By the time these boys grew into men, violence was not shocking. It was ordinary. The games had normalized it, embedded it in their understanding of justice, honor, and entertainment. Rome did not simply rule its children with discipline, it trained them with blood. And in the Colosseum, the next generation of Romans learned the same lesson as their fathers. Mercy was a stranger, and cruelty was a citizen's duty. The Colosseum was more than an amphitheater. It was a machine. Beneath its arches and marble seats stretched a labyrinth of tunnels, pulleys, and wooden frameworks, the hypodium, a hidden world where cruelty was engineered with the precision of a stage play. To the spectators above, the arena seemed alive, a place where beasts leapt from nowhere, forests grew in minutes, and oceans appeared in the heart of a city. But behind the illusion was technology, a machinery of death as sophisticated as it was ruthless. The most shocking feature was the trapdoor. Dozens of them dotted the arena floor, invisible beneath the sand. At a signal, handlers below would release ropes, and a panel would spring open. Lions starved for days would suddenly erupt into the sunlight, or gladiators would find themselves flanked by hidden enemies rising from beneath their feet. To the crowd, it looked like magic. To the victims, it was terror choreographed. Elevators powered by counterweights and manpower lifted cages, platforms, and even entire stage sets into view. Ancient engineers designed winches so strong that they could hoist a rhinoceros, a bear, or a group of chained prisoners into the arena in a single motion. Archaeologists have reconstructed these devices, and the results are staggering. Wooden elevators rising with the force of 20 men pulling ropes, the sound of gears grinding beneath the roar of the crowd. Every mechanical creak was part of the theatre, every surprise a testament to Rome's mastery of spectacle. The illusions extended beyond animals and men. The arena itself could change shape. With canvas backdrops, props, and clever landscaping, the sandy floor became a desert, a forest, even a battlefield. Pine trees hauled through the tunnels were hoisted into sockets to create instant groves. Painted scenery gave the impression of mountains, caves, or distant seas. In some shows, water was pumped in through underground channels, flooding the basin to mimic shallow lakes, where small ships clashed in mock naval fights. It was a theatre of transformation, nature itself bent to Rome's will. For the victims, these shifting landscapes were a nightmare. A prisoner condemned to face a lion might expect a flat arena. Instead, he would emerge into a fabricated woodland where beasts lurked behind trees, springing from cover. A gladiator could find the floor turned slick with water, forcing him to stumble while his opponent advanced. The scenery was not decoration, it was weaponized. And for the crowd, this was the true marvel. They weren't only watching men fight or animals die, they were witnessing Rome's engineers prove that nothing, not even the elements, could resist the empire's hand. Forests could be grown in minutes, deserts built on stone, seas conjured in the heart of the city. Control over nature was as thrilling as control over life. The Colosseum wasn't just a place of death, it was a stage where technology turned cruelty into theatre. Every trapdoor, every pulley, every illusion was another reminder that Rome did not simply rule people, it ruled the very fabric of the world. And for an empire obsessed with dominance, that was the greatest spectacle of all. The cruelty of the arena was not contained by Rome's walls. It spread outward, carried like a contagion into the farthest provinces of the empire. Governors, desperate to prove loyalty to the capital, staged their own spectacles, miniature echoes of the Colosseum, each with a local twist that reflected the land in which it was performed. In these distant amphitheatres, cruelty was not only repeated, it was reinvented. In Gaul, where winter cut to the bone, criminals were sometimes condemned not to beasts, but to the elements. Ancient accounts speak of men and women stripped and bound, hurled into icy rivers as spectators cheered from the banks. The water swallowed them in silence, turning execution into a frozen theatre. To Roman eyes, this was fitting. In Rome, fire and lions served as punishments. In Gaul, the cold itself became an executioner. The message was clear. Even nature could be drafted into Rome's service. Far to the east, in the arid provinces of Syria and Mesopotamia, cruelty adapted to the desert. Prisoners were paraded into the open sun, chained and left to wither, while winds drove the sand against their bodies. The storm was the spectacle, a slow abrasion that blinded eyes, tore skin, and buried the condemned in a living grave. Crowds gathered as if at a festival, watching men vanish into dunes as if swallowed by the wrath of the gods. These punishments were no less theatrical than the Colosseum's staged myths. They were theatre written in sand and wind. Africa too provided its own variations. In Carthage, governors staged executions where men were left for crocodiles along the Nile tributaries, the reptiles dragged from the waters to tear victims apart before awed crowds. Elsewhere, criminals were bound to stakes in the desert night, left for hyenas and jackals. The cruelty was not improvised, it was a statement. To govern a province meant not only collecting taxes and maintaining order, but demonstrating Rome's grip on life and death through spectacle. These provincial displays were more than local entertainments. They were political theatre. A governor who staged brutal games signalled two things to Rome: his wealth and his loyalty. By copying the cruelty of the capital, he reminded both the emperor and the local population that Rome's power was not distant. It was present, immediate, inescapable. The export of the games had a corrosive effect. Communities that once honoured their own festivals and traditions saw them warped into spectacles of blood. Local gods were replaced with Roman myths, reenacted through suffering. Executions became rituals of assimilation. To watch a criminal torn apart in Gaul, or a prisoner buried in sand in Syria, was to be reminded that Rome's empire was everywhere, not only in stone walls and legions, but in the very way people were taught to see death. In this way, the Colosseum became a template copied across continents. Its cruelty was not confined to marble arches in the heart of Rome, but echoed in frozen rivers, burning deserts, and crocodile-infested waters. The empire exported not only law, language, and roads, it exported spectacle, and in doing so, it taught the provinces the same lesson it had drilled into the capital. Mercy was weakness, and cruelty was the currency of power. The Colosseum dazzled its crowds with grandeur, but its greatest illusion was invisibility. Beneath the roars, the trumpets, and the spray of blood lay an army of men and women whose names were never recorded. The games depended on them. They built the sets, fed the beasts, dragged away the corpses. They were slaves, condemned labourers, and forgotten workers who toiled in the shadows so Rome could cheer in the sun. The Hippodrome, the vast underworld beneath the arena, was their prison. In its maze of tunnels, hundreds of slaves sweated in the dark, pulling ropes, heaving counterweights, and cranking winches that powered the elevators above. At a signal, they unleashed lions into the light, raised forests through trapdoors, or flooded the floor with water. The crowd gasped at the miracles of engineering. No one applauded the hands that made them possible. It was brutal work. Each show required tons of sand to be hauled in and raked flat, absorbing blood before being replaced again and again. Corpses had to be dragged through hidden passages, stripped of armour, and dumped in pits. The stench of death lingered below, mingling with the musk of animals starved into frenzy. For the slaves, this was daily life, living in darkness, labouring in shifts, hearing the thunder of the crowd above as they bent their backs to make the spectacle run smoothly. Accidents were constant. A misfired pulley could crush men against stone. A slipped rope could send a cage tumbling, releasing beasts too soon. Ancient graffiti hints at tragedies, lions breaking free in the tunnels, handlers mauled before they could reach the surface. No chronicler recorded their names, but every show exacted a hidden death toll. For every gladiator who fell in the sand, there were slaves who perished unseen. Feeding the beasts was another nightmare task. Slaves were ordered to drag donkeys, goats, or even condemned criminals into cages, often mauled themselves in the process. Archaeological evidence shows animal bones mixed with human remains in pits beneath the Colosseum, silent testimony to the labourers consumed by the very monsters they prepared for spectacle. And yet, these workers were never acknowledged. To Rome, their suffering was part of the machinery, no more visible than the ropes or pulleys they pulled. The senators in the stands could marvel at the smooth transition of scenes, the seamless appearance of beasts, the blood swept away between acts. But all of it was purchased with sweat and terror in the dark. Without slaves, there was no spectacle. They were the hidden gears of Rome's cruel machine, condemned to toil without glory, to bleed without applause. If the gladiators were pawns in the empire's theatre of death, then the slaves beneath the sand were the stagehands of cruelty itself. Rome's audiences never saw them, but their labour was the foundation of every roar, every gasp, every cheer, and in the silence of history, their suffering still lingers, unrecorded but essential, the forgotten cost of Rome's most infamous shows. When the sun set over Rome and the crowds poured out of the Colosseum, most believed the day's violence was done. The seats emptied, the vendors packed away their baskets, and the city seemed to return to its ordinary rhythm. But sometimes, when the torches were lit and the gates barred, the arena came alive again. These were not public games. They were private shows, spectacles staged for emperors, senators, and select guests. By day, cruelty was theatre for the masses. By night, it became something far more secretive and often far more disturbing. The torchlight gave the arena a different character. Flames flickered against the stone, throwing long shadows across the sand. In this eerie glow, executions took on a new spectacle. Condemned men were brought out, not to the thunder of 50,000 voices, but to the laughter of a few drunken elites. Chains rattled in the silence. The condemned begged, as they always did. But here, mercy was even less likely. Without the restraint of a crowd, cruelty had no limits. Rumours whispered through the empire of emperors staging their own midnight entertainments. Caligula, notorious for his sadism, is said to have ordered prisoners thrown to beasts in the dark so that their screams echoed unseen. Domitian, obsessed with unpredictability, sometimes held late-night hunts where animals were released into torchlit gloom, the spectacle more about terror than visibility. Even Commodus, ever the showman, was known to slaughter beasts by torchlight, relishing the intimacy of applause from a handful of chosen eyes rather than the roar of a crowd he could not control. The atmosphere blurred the line between entertainment and debauchery. Guests drank heavily, toasting each kill with goblets of wine. Music, softer than the trumpets of the day, drifted through the seats. Flutes, lyres, sometimes singers forced to perform as men died before them. It was cruelty dressed as festivity, theatre reduced to banquet entertainment. And because these shows were not bound by the rigid schedules of public games, they could descend into improvisation, executions staged for amusement, sexual humiliations forced on prisoners, grotesque mock plays whispered about, but never officially recorded. Very little survives in the historical record of these forbidden spectacles. Perhaps deliberately so. Chroniclers wrote for public memory, not for secrets whispered under torchlight, but fragments of rumour, scattered through letters and hostile accounts of emperors, suggest that the most inhumane acts were often those never meant for the public eye. To Rome, the Colosseum by day displayed the empire's power. By night, it revealed its vices. The silence of history is itself telling. What went on in the torchlit arena was too scandalous, too shameful, even for writers accustomed to recounting mass slaughter, and so it lingers only as shadow, a ghostly echo of spectacles darker than daylight ever revealed. For the Romans, cruelty was not confined to schedules or seasons. It could spill into the night, lit by fire, fueled by wine, and remembered only in whispers. And in those forbidden spectacles, Rome showed its truest face, not as a civilization of order and law, but as an empire drunk on its own power, rehearsing cruelty even when no one was watching.